I'm Dr. CBS here with Dr. Jared Ball, and you're tuned into episode 3 of The Last Dope Intellectual. All right, so before we get into Shoot the Shit this week, I just want to note that we have the birthdays of 2 important figures in Black radical history this week. That's Huey P. Newton. His birthday is February 17th. And then, of course, we have Mama Claudia Jones, whose birthday is February 21st. So just wanted to give a little shout out to that. So, Jared, this week for Shoot the Shit, we have something to talk about that may seem trivial to perhaps non-academics, but I think can actually apply probably across, even beyond the academy. So, and this is citational practice, right? So who do we cite? Why does it matter if we are cited or not cited? And should folks come at us or should we come at others for not citing us? So I have 2 stories. The first is that there was a journal article published that came out recently that I circulated on Twitter. And it happened as well that I had served as a reviewer for this article, right? And so one of my colleagues basically had mentioned that, he was going to reach out to the person because he had not been cited. And then he was like, actually, no, it's probably the role of, or the fault of the journal and of the reviewers. And I was like, well, I was a reviewer, and it even crossed my mind to mention, your work here, because what I saw as the arc of the argument did not necessarily require an engagement with this work, right? And it's not to say my colleague that reached out to me, his work is great. It's really, it should be cited. And so on the one hand, I can understand feeling like your meaningful contributions are constantly overlooked. Okay. But on the other hand, it's kind of like, I feel like, people are making informed and intentional choices about who they cite or who they don't cite, or they ought to be, right? And so that's one story. Second story is a little bit more nefarious, and I had to respond in kind. So on academia.edu, I have one of my syllabi published, right? And for whatever reason, I guess academia.edu might recommend articles or syllabi or whatever to other users. So this syllabi was recommended to a user who I happen to know, who reached out to me and said, I noticed you didn't cite me on this syllabus, and that's okay. Here are some other readings you might consider, and then I think I had a book by Skip Gates, had edited a book called Call and Response. That's actually a book of it's primary documents. And so he's like, that's an interesting choice for a Marxist. And so just was really examining my syllabus. Mind you, that syllabus is from 2018. Of course, I have revised it since then, and indeed, some of the texts he mentioned are now on there. But I took exception to that because it's like, number one, just because academia.edu sent you this shit does not mean you need to contact me. And furthermore, including you is beside the point. You're not a founder of my field. And there's other people who are founders who make a similar argument to you. Moreover, and so I just had to politely remind him, I am classically trained in Black studies. I have a BA, MA, and PhD in the field. And secondly, and so anyway, we had this exchange back and forth. He told me that I need to have some intellectual humility. And I said, I am in a community of scholars who I respect and admire and who are actually invested in my work and in my pedagogy. And I don't need people parachuting in, telling me who I should and should not be teaching or citing. So that was that. So what is your perspective on this whole citational thing? And, is this just academic grandstanding, or is it, what do you think?
Well, to be fair, I've been on all sides of this issue, and I have been aggressive in reaching out to people and being like, what's up? How could you not reference the work I'm involved in? Or when people have reached out to me and said, Jared, can you help promote my work? Or including a statement that says, Jared, I really appreciate your work. and it was instrumental in me developing mine, and then I read through it and I'm not mentioned, I have reached out to them and said, you want me to promote your book where you claim I've been instrumental in whatever, but I don't appear at all. And the way, so part of it, I admit, could be a lot of different things about personality, could be sometimes petty, but I really think that citations are political ultimately. So people within the academy should understand this, that obviously when it comes to things like promotion and tenure, people count references, people count how often you're cited, people count who's referencing your work and how they're referencing your work. So when people, from my perspective, and who you've done work with, or who should know better, don't reference you, I think that is a problem. So I think it is a little bit beyond just a situation of being academic. I think it goes across fields and across disciplines and across fields of work and employment, that people want credit for their work. I always joke that I'm Dustin Hoffman in Wag the Dog. Like, I'm the one who gets escorted out by the state at the end and assassinated because he has to have credit for his involvement in what he does. But at the same time, I think it is, important to anyway, I think it is important to reference people. I think it is political, and I do think there is a politics and a something beyond just pettiness to it. Now, how it comes up, and in some of the cases you bring up in your stories, I think, again, it is somewhat case specific. And I think when people claim, I'm not present because I'm not being counted as a foundation, a founder of a field or something to that, and when they maybe have to reach that level, I mean, that's something else. But, and then last point, I'm sorry to go on so long, but the last point I would say is that some people have to be referenced. I think that, there are people with whom I incredibly strongly disagree. But if you're being fair to the discipline, if you're being fair to the argument, they have to be referenced. They've earned that right. So you can bring them up in syllabi and elsewhere for discussion and even debate. But they, so anyway. Those are my maybe 2 to 5 cents on that.
So 1 to 4, given the weakness of the dollar. But so I guess I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, so there's like the whole like hashtag like cite Black women movement on the one hand, right? Which is actually trying, I think, to fill in a gap where it's like all the historians are white males. And we know that this simply is not the case. And Black women who are actually instrumental, especially in slavery studies, right, tend to be sort of marginalized in these discussions or in these sort of references to text or works about slavery. So I get that. And then there's also the question of intellectual McCarthyism, right? So when we talk about who to cite, and we don't cite, so on the one hand, it's like we have to cite these particular scholars because they're instrumental to the field, but these scholars are reproducing particular types of intellectual McCarthyism because they don't know shit about the radicals who also have been doing that work, or who are instrumental to the story that they're telling, but they either don't know or choose not to reference these radicals because of, anti-Marxism, because ostensibly, Marxist work is not objective and all these other things. And so I think that that's something else to consider. But it's kind of like, I guess in other fields, it might be like, okay, if you're having some type of event or action and you don't include a particular organization, and that organization is like, well, why weren't we included in this? And so I think that it can't, like, moving from the realm of citation, it can imply in other ways, but it's interesting because I think that sometimes it can be a little bit cloudy, and sometimes it can be a little bit like, ass on your shoulders, like thinking that you need to be referenced in every conversation. But as you mentioned, on the other hand, it can be a matter of politics and a matter of erasure, and a matter of like, who are you in solidarity with, and how can we make our footnotes or make our citational practice about community, right? And about sort of giving voice to or giving shine to particular types of work that has informed our own. And, even if it doesn't come directly to mind, if it's something that's brought up, like, hey, you should have cited me here, like taking that with humility and being like, okay, you're right. That was an oversight on my part or whatever.
No, and I've been on both sides of it also. Even even in doing like radio hosting, people feel a kind of way when they see some people show up as guests and not others. And sometimes people have reached out to me and say, how come you not, how come I haven't been on the show? And how come I didn't show up in your citation list? And, and sometimes it's a legit question. And sometimes, to your earlier point, it's like, come on now, be a little humble about where you are in relationship to who is invited and cited, anyway.
Okay, well, we shot the shit about citational practice, and we have offered no solutions. We just are discussing the problem. So that's that. So we have two new segments on the show today. One is called In Review. And so in this segment, I'll review texts, books, articles, posts, podcasts, or whatever else strikes my fancy that I've been either thinking about or thinking with in whatever aspect of work I'm working on, or just that I've encountered in the world. So today I'm actually thinking about and thinking with Du Bois's 1915 article, The African Roots of War. And I'm thinking about this article, number one, because I'm writing this chapter on Du Bois' imperialism and labor, but also because I find myself returning to the African roots of war often. So essentially what he's arguing is that it is the African continent that's central to the First World War. That is the first imperialist war. And so essentially Germany, London, France, and other countries are competing for the booty on offer that is on the African continent. And that imperialism is actually an essential foundation to war. And that war is actually a way for imperial powers to redistribute the wealth and resources throughout the world. And typically this is wealth and resources that are extracted from the racialized world, right? And so he's specifically focusing on the African continent in this particular piece. I think it's really important that we focus on this, especially because we are in a moment of heightened American imperialism, to really be thinking about the different ways that people in the tradition of radical Blackness have been writing about imperialism and writing about the ways in which white supremacy, imperialism, war, and colonialism are mutually constitutive. And of course, for those who have read my work on racial capitalism, these are the foundational elements of racial capitalism to me. But the other reason I'm thinking about Du Bois's African Roots of War is because my organization, Black Alliance for Peace, is, of course, has this ongoing work around AFRICOM, and has recently done some work around the current situation in Haiti and the connections between things like the 1033 program here in the United States, AFRICOM, and then U.S. imperial backing of Bois in Haiti, and the ways in which U.S., UN, and the quote unquote core groups intervention and role in Haiti is actually exacerbating the conflict and is turning Haiti into an occupied force, right? And Haiti is essentially under occupation and has been under occupation by the UN. And all of this is rooted in imperialism and the undermining of sovereignty and self-determination. If you want to hear more about this, our comrade and we love Jemima Pierre was recently on Voices with Vision, giving insight into this. And also there's a piece in Black Agenda Report, and the Black Alliance for Peace has come out with a statement on this, on the Haiti situation, if you want to know more. But anyway, Du Bois in 1915 is really thinking deeply about this issue and about the ways that the white working class actually benefits from imperialism, because even though they are exploited, they get to share in the spoils of the quote chinks and niggers, right? So this is what Du Bois writes, and that this is the idea of the labor aristocracy, that even as the white working class or the working class in imperial countries are exploited, they're actually benefiting from imperial machinations, and imperialism actually mitigates their exploitation. And so this is just a really important argument, I think, as to why we, number one, his article is important because it brings together war, imperialism, colonialism, and labor exploitation. And it also points to the central role of racialized people, not least Black people, in the struggle for liberation. So it's not just this white industrial proletariat, but rather those who really suffer at the yoke of the intersections of imperialism, capitalism, and colonialism, and then processes of racialization. It's just a really excellent article, and it's one that I think is very germane to our moment as American imperialism continues, I do think it's reaching its limit, but it continues and is still tied to the expropriation of resources. It is still tied to land dispossession. It is still tied to getting cheap or free labor from those on the darker side of the color line. So I just highly recommend Du Bois's 1915 article, The African Roots of War, because it really sort of is foundational to many of his other writings on the subject of Africa, on the subject of labor, on the subject of war. And it's not too long, so check it out. So our second news segment is called Discourse in That Course. And okay, so the title of this segment comes from, there's this book called Skin Trade, right? By this woman named Ann Ducille. And within this book, she has a chapter called Discourse in That Course, Postcoloniality and Afrocentricity. So this is just a table of contents. Y'all probably can't see that.
And if I may just quickly interject, the very prolific Ann Ducille.
Very prolific. So she's a literary scholar. She was an early scholar who was contributing to Black studies. And essentially that article is what she says in that article is that the discourse at that moment, which is basically the mid-1990s, is post-colonialism. So everybody is talking about post-colonialism. Everybody is excited about this discourse. It's hegemonic, right? And then the DAT course is Afrocentricity. So it's engaged in a similar type of sort of cultural rethinking project, but it is marginalized, it is sidestepped, it is not taken as seriously. And so in this segment, Discourse in That Course, Jared and I will just talk about any issue that has at least two sides, one that is sort of the more dominant or the more known or the more accepted view, and one that is that we know less about, that we are less accepting of, or that simply just needs to get some attention. So that's the idea behind Discourse in That Course. So this week, we're talking about the Fred Hampton movie. So for the discourse part, that relates to people who have seen the movie and who, and this includes people who are supportive of it or people who are critical of it, but think that it's important to see the movie. So Jared, this is sort of like your take. And so say more about perhaps the movie, why you think it's important, the different conversations that are happening, et cetera.
Well, if for anything, I only think it's only for me important to see the movie because it's a pop cultural phenomenon of sorts, and to be in from my point of view, to be in the discussion, whether dealing with students or other people, I felt it necessary to see it, even though I really struggle with that with my whole Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance, trying to that we shouldn't be looking for ourselves in any of these films and these pop cultural commercial products. So. But I did see the film, and I thought I was in the DAT course of this issue. You have outdated me on this issue, and which is very impressive, but I also think equally important. So where I fell in was that, I did see it. I thought it was important to offer up, what I think is a series of important criticisms of the film. But at the same time, like I said, you've outdone me on this once again. So, but which again, I think is a very important position.
So I am in the DAT course because I am not seeing this movie, period. Now, I am reminded of the Black Panther, right? And I had initially refused to see this movie because I'm like, I just took extreme exception to people knowing more about Wakanda, a fictional African site, than they know about any of the 54 countries. And just the all of the hoopla about it, I just wasn't feeling it, right? But many of my students have seen it, and I felt like, okay, for the culture, I need to see it. And I regretted seeing it, not least because of the celebration of the CIA agent. At the end, anytime the CIA agent is the good guy, it's a no. So the other problem I had with Black Panther, among many, was like the sort of pathologizing, I felt like, of African Americanness and of a particular type of Black nationalism. So I regretted seeing it. And so I'm not making the same mistake with this movie. And despite the wonderful, I would say, rationale for seeing the movie that many of my comrades have offered, not least you, Jared. To me, as somebody who studies stool pigeons, infiltration, anti-communism and anti-radicalism from the early stages of COINTELPRO, which was the infiltration of the Communist Party that then shifted to the decimation of Black liberation movements, it's actually painful for me to to read about this, to see it, and to study it. Like I have a visceral response to it. So for example, I spent 2 summers in the papers of this man named Richard Gibson, who turned out to be this very nefarious informant and pseudo agent of the CIA. So he had this first stint in the 1950s that related to Black people in Paris. He was one of the founders of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And then there's letters of him offering his services to the FBI. They rejected him, but ultimately he began to work with the CIA. And there was like inklings of this. It was sort of like an open, not necessarily an open secret, but people sort of had suspicions about this. So one aspect of Richard Gibson's nefariousness is the Harrington Affair. And so this was something that happened in the sort of Black community that were expatriates in France at that moment. I won't go into that, but there's information about this. Next, Gibson goes on to found the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And then there's letters of him offering his services to the FBI. The FBI rejected him. He goes on to be an operative in various ways for the CIA. I spent 2 summers in his papers, and there had been inklings about him. So for example, there was something published in the publication Soul book about him. There had been all sorts of, E. Franklin Frazier had some suspicions, and there had just been all sorts of conversation, but of course he will always deny this. And throughout his papers, you see him constantly referencing the fact that people think he's an agent and why he's not. He always brings this up because he's very, he knows that people know about this. And he just, it was just mind-boggling to see the level of misdirection and information that he was gathering. And I just was very disturbed by it. There's not only him, there's this woman called Julia Clarice Brown who had infiltrated the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, which is this Black radical women's organization. And, to look through her files and see all the stuff she was reporting, there's this woman, Lola Bell Holmes, who actually was an informant, who was providing information about Claude Lightfoot. And I just remember John Bracey telling me this story that when Lightfoot was in court and it was revealed that Lola Bell Holmes was the informant, people screamed, right? Like people and Lightfoot cried because these were people who had embedded themselves into their lives, who they saw as comrades, who then became, who all along were informants or became informants along the way. So all of that to say, I just think it's whack that before we have a principled full-length film about Fred Hampton, we have a film about the informant on Fred Hampton. And it's just it feels especially trash that this is happening in a moment of insurgency, right? In a moment of heightened consciousness, in a moment of people, gathering together and organizing against the state in particular ways, right? It just I don't know. I just think, and of course, people point out that it's not that the informant is painted in any positive light. That's not the point. He's still centered. And one of my comrades, Wendy Muse, raised on Twitter, it's as if one was telling the story of Martin Luther King from the perspective of James Earl Ray. Where they do that at, right? And so I'm not going to see it. But what I will say, I feel confident in my choice because so many people I trust, whose criticism I trust and whose analysis I trust, y'all got it. So there are political education sessions being held around it, pointing out, anywhere from like examining COINTELPRO to telling the true story of Fred Hampton, et cetera, et cetera. And of course there will be the think piece industrial complex, which I'm not looking forward to, but I do feel like Black left folks in all different ways are speaking about the film, speaking about the problems of it, and using it as a tool of political education. So Y'all got it, but I ain't saying it. And that's my dark horse on that. I dream me a world in which one will stop being lured by visually stunning things. Because the thing about also, like, think about like a lot of poisons taste good, right? A lot of things that are toxic seem good or feel good. And secondly, that we can, fundraise for something like the Hampton House or the Robeson House or anything else without without Hollywood. All right, so now for what I'm on, y'all. I am in the weeds. I am doing the thing. I'm revising the second chapter of my dissertation into chapter 2 of Black Scare, Red Scare. So this second chapter is tentatively titled Anti-Blackness, Anti-Radicalism, Legitimating Architecture. I'm in it, y'all. I'm doing it. And so basically the first chapter is about the structural location of Blackness. And then this chapter is getting into the rationalizations and narrations of capitalist racism. And so I actually workshopped the dissertation chapter and, so some process stuff with at UT Knoxville on the 12th. And so they gave some helpful feedback as to what direction the dissertation chapter should go to be revised into the manuscript chapter. They gave some ideas about the things that were unclear or what might need more development. And so I just as an aside, I highly recommend like workshopping your stuff, even if it's not done, even if it's in the starting stages, even if you don't feel like it's perfect, workshop it because you will get great feedback. Well, let me not say that. You might get good feedback or not so good feedback, which then will just solidify you in the direction that you're going. But I highly recommend workshopping, and you can also workshop at different stages. So you can have your set of folks who you workshop when things are still in the messy middle. And then you can have your folks that you workshop with, and this might be people you know less well, or this might be you being invited to some type of workshop like I was. And then that you might workshop when it's in a more polished stage. And when it's in a stage that you feel more comfortable sharing, I always say, the B- stage is when you start to workshop in that way. But anyway, share your work. Don't hold on to it because the feedback is generally useful. And also the deadline of the workshop gives you a sort of marker to work back from. Anyway, so I'm working on this chapter, and one of the things that I've been developing is this idea of true Americanism and theorizing the conjuncture of anti-radicalism and anti-Blackness as the antithesis of true Americanism. And so that is to say, anti-radicalism and anti-Blackness as the foundational framework of true Americanism. So in my dissertation chapter, I was talking a lot about the Black as opposed to Blackness and about the radical as opposed to radicalism. And so I did a lot around the idea of citizenship and, un-Americanness and subversion, et cetera. And so I kind of have to work out, first of all, I need to draw the distinction between Blackness and anti-Blackness, which was not something I did in my dissertation. And then I need to work through how citizenship and whiteness are actually enunciations of true Americanism. And then this provides a sort of basis for the forms of violence, discipline, and exclusion that are that become part and parcel of maintaining capitalist racism. So anyway, that might be gibberish to most of y'all, but it is a development for me. And all of that to say, like, the writing is underway. I'm working for at least 30 minutes every day. That might seem like a little bit, but that's one Pomodoro. So I'm making progress slowly but surely on Black Scare, Red Scare. And it was good to have something to start from. So it was good to have the dissertation chapter to start from. And, even though a lot of it will be discarded or a lot of it will be moved to other aspects of the manuscript, chapter 2 of the book is one of the only chapters that is drawing from my dissertation, drawing directly from previously written things in my dissertation. So it was good to start there. So I'm not starting from scratch. So, things are underway. It's happening. So that is what I'm on currently. So we've reached the end of the show. Jared, Any last thoughts?
I do. And the one that I have very quickly is that you made reference to the wonderful Dr. Pierre earlier, and I happen to have caught that interview live with our brother Netfa Freeman on Voices with Vision. Shout out to WPFW and the wonderful program director there, Katia Stitt. And she said something that is, Dr. Pierre said something in there that I thought was so dope. She was talking about the impact of Obama on the Black community, and I think it's something that's still relevant to this day. And she said she used that whole that I guess it's a parable or aphorism maybe, where she said that when the axe enters the forest, the trees see the handle and say it's one of us. I said, damn, that's cold. I said she froze my hot coffee that morning with that cold line. When the axe enters the forest, the trees see the handle and say that's one of us. I said, that's something, even in terms of how we deal with popular culture as it portends to project our histories to us. I think that's a perfect, warning statement. So anyway, that was the thought I had, and just another great episode for you and the last dope intellectual. So that was it.
Yes, thank you so much. And just Jemima Pierre has written extensively on a number of topics, but especially on Haiti and Black Agenda Report. So check out her writings and her amazing book, The Predicament of Blackness, which is about race and racialization in Ghana. Just dope all around. Okay, so in terms of recap, me and Jared shot the shit about citational practice. Who do we cite? If we are not cited, how do we address that? And, the political foundations or aspects of citations. I reviewed W.E.B. Du Bois's The African Roots of War, not only how it resonates with the Haiti situation today, but just generally the contributions of that piece to understanding racial capitalism. We introduced a new segment, Discourse and Dat Course, where Jared was in the discourse about the Fred Hampton movie. I was in the Dat Course because I ain't seeing that shit. So, and then for what I'm on, I just talked about I'm in the weeds for the second chapter of my book. And, promoted the idea of workshopping. And that is our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with me. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. CBS, here with Dr. Jared Ball, and we are signing off.